Welcome to the Deep Dive. You know the show where we take like a ton of info and we really boil it down to the stuff you actually need to know.
Yeah, we cut through all the noise so you don't have to. No information overload here.
Exactly. So today, we're going deep on the Silk Road. Well, maybe we should say the Silk Routes.
Yeah, good point. It wasn't just one road, was it? More like a whole network of trade routes.
Right, connecting east and west for centuries. We're talking about a huge span of time, like from the 2nd century BCE all the way to the mid-15th century CE.
That's over 1,600 years of history and over 4,000 miles across, connecting continents.
And this deep dive is going to be all about pulling out the most interesting bits, the surprising stuff, without getting lost in all those tiny details.
Exactly. We'll keep it focused on the big picture. We're looking at the impact, the key takeaways, that sort of thing.
So let's start with that name, Silk Road. I mean, it sounds pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah, you think of silk, you think of China, you think of, I don't know, camels and deserts.
But it wasn't just about silk, was it? And even that name, some historians prefer silk routes to show it was a much more complex web of connections, right? Like land routes, sea routes, all kinds of stuff going on.
Exactly. It was a network, not a single highway.
So what else was being traded in those early days?
Well, from the east, silk was obviously huge, but there was also tea, dyes, perfumes. Later on, you start to see porcelain becoming a big export.
And what was coming back the other way? From the west, I mean.
Lots of important stuff. You had horses and camels, obviously vital for travel across those distances.
Makes sense.
Then things like honey, wine, gold. Oh, and some pretty impactful stuff, too. Think paper and gunpowder coming from the east, but they'd go on to change things drastically in the west.
Wow, yeah, huge impact. So how did this whole network actually work? It's not like people were traveling the entire route, right?
No, not usually. It was mostly decentralized. You'd have these middlemen, traders, who would move goods along sections of the route. So goods would change hands multiple times along the way.
Makes sense, given the sheer distance and all the different landscapes.
Exactly. And let's not forget the dangers. Bandits, raiders, not to mention the terrain itself, deserts, mountains, all kinds of hazards.
Sounds rough. But despite all that, the Silk Road wasn't just about trade, right? It was a cultural exchange, too. People, ideas, religions, they were all moving along with the goods.
Yeah, definitely. Buddhism, for example, spread extensively, and as it moved, it adapted, mixed with local beliefs. It wasn't a static thing. It was constantly evolving.
So it wasn't just about stuff, it was about ideas, too.
Absolutely. A whole mix of people were traveling these routes, merchants, pilgrims, scholars, soldiers, you name it, and they brought their cultures and beliefs with them. But it wasn't all positive. You also had diseases spreading along these routes, like the plague. It's a reminder that interconnectedness can have downsides, too.
Yeah, for sure. So what led to the decline of the Silk Road? I mean, it was such a dominant force for so long.
Well, a few things happened. By the 15th century, the Ottoman Empire was rising. They started controlling a lot of the key land routes, making things more difficult.
Okay.
And at the same time, Europeans were starting to look for new sea routes to the east. That's how you get the Age of Discovery and eventually maritime trade taking over.
It's amazing how one shift can have such a ripple effect.
Yeah, for sure.
Ah.
But the Silk Road hasn't totally disappeared. There's talk of a new Silk Road these days with projects like the Eurasian Land Bridge and China's Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI.
Trying to revive those old connections, huh?
Exactly. And let's not forget UNESCO. They've made parts of the Silk Road World Heritage Sites, recognizing their historical importance.
So that name, Silk Road, it still holds a lot of weight today.
Mm-hmm.
But we mentioned earlier that there's some debate about its historical significance. What are some of the alternative viewpoints?
Well, there's this historian, Warwick Ball. He argues that the sea trade with India and Arabia, especially the spice trade, was actually more important to the Roman economy than the silk trade with China. Yeah. And he even says that the idea of this one unified Silk Road with free trade before the Mongol period, well, it might be a bit of a myth. He points out that the term Silk Road didn't even exist back then. It's a modern term. And a lot of recent research is highlighting how important those sea routes were and how silk wasn't the only key commodity.
So it's a more nuanced picture than just silk in China.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Ball argues that the Romans mostly interacted with middlemen, like the Sogdians, not directly with China through some kind of continuous Silk Road. And then you have someone like William Dalrymple, who talks about how much cheaper sea travel was compared to land travel. He argues that there was this India-dominated Golden Road connecting Rome to Japan even before the 13th century.
Interesting. So the focus shifts from China to India, from silk to spices.
Right. And remember, those southern parts of the routes, the ones connecting Khotan to eastern China, they were originally used for jade trade way back in 5000 BCE. Some scholars even say that Jade Road might be a more accurate name for those early connections, even if silk became the more famous trade later on.
Fascinating. It really shows how complex this whole system was.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's get into the routes themselves. We know it wasn't just one path, right?
Yeah, you had a few main routes. Over land, you had the northern and southern routes both ways to get around the Taklamakan Desert and that Lopner area.
Right, those are pretty formidable obstacles.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So let's start with the northern route. That one started in Chang'an, that's modern-day Xi'an. It became a more established route around the 1st century BCE when the Han Dynasty, under Emperor Wudi, got more control over those nomadic tribes in the area.
Makes sense. So how did it go from there?
Well, it went northwest through Gansu province. Then it split into a few different paths. 2 of them went around the Taklamakan Desert, one north, one south, and they met back up in Kashgar. That was a major trading hub.
Gotcha.
And then a third route went north of the Tian Shan Mountains. It passed through places like Almaty, that's in Kazakhstan now, before turning west.
Okay.
West of Kashgar, the route split again. One branch headed towards Termez in Uzbekistan and Balkh in Afghanistan. And the other one went through the Fergana Valley, that's eastern Uzbekistan now, and then crossed the Karakum Desert. Both those routes eventually connected up with the main southern route before reaching Merv. That was another big trading center in Turkmenistan.
So the northern route was pretty complicated itself.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And then there was another branch that went northwest, north of the Aral and Caspian Seas, all the way to the Black Sea. Lots of different paths.
So what were they trading on the northern road?
All kinds of things. Coming into China, you had dates, saffron, pistachio nuts from Persia. From further west, you had frankincense, myrrh, sandalwood, even glass bottles from Egypt. Basically anything valuable.
You go the other way.
Well, from China, you'd have silk brocade, lacquerware, porcelain. Those are the big exports.
Okay. Now, what about the southern route? How is that different?
The southern route, sometimes it's called the Karakoram route, was more direct from China. It went over the Karakoram Mountains. That's a tough route. It actually still exists today as the Karakoram Highway, connecting Pakistan and China. Yeah, it's a pretty impressive feat of engineering. Anyway, from there, it went west with some branches heading south to ports on the Indian coast. It crossed the high passes, went through northern Pakistan, over the Hindu Kush, into Afghanistan, and eventually met up with the northern route near Merv.
Okay.
And then from Merv, it continued west through northern Iran, Mesopotamia, the Syrian desert, and finally reached the Levant. That's where it connected with the Mediterranean, so you could get to Europe by ship.
Right.
And there were other branches, too. One went north through Anatolia, another went south to North Africa. And from Herat, there was a branch that went through Persia to the Persian Gulf, then across to Petra, and then Egypt and other Mediterranean ports. So yeah, it was still branching, but it had a more consistent westward path, even though it went through some really tough terrain.
So tougher terrain, but a more direct route.
Yeah, I guess you could say that. But those mountains weren't easy to cross.
I bet. Now, there's also this southwestern route that's mentioned, but it's not as well known. What can you tell us about that one?
The southwestern route seems to have used the Ganges and Brahmaputra River Delta region. You know, Strabo, that Roman writer from the 1st century, he mentioned merchants sailing all the way from Egypt to the Ganges. Well, they've found Roman beads and stuff at this ancient site, Wari Batoshwar, in Bangladesh. And it really seems like that area was a big trading hub, maybe even before the Common Era.
Wow, so not all the Silk Road routes were through those dry landscapes?
Nope, not at all. They traded gemstones and other stuff from Southeast Asia through that delta. Some researchers think it was a big international route connecting Sichuan, Yunnan, Burma, and Bangladesh, maybe even used for transporting gold and other valuable goods. And they keep finding archaeological evidence in Bangladesh that supports this idea.
Really emphasizes how diverse this whole trade network was. And then, of course, there's the Maritime Silk Road. That's a whole other aspect of this, right?
Yeah, the Maritime Silk Road was the sea-based part of this whole system. It connected Southeast Asia, East Asia, the Indian subcontinent, Arabia, East Africa, even Europe. It started around the 2nd century BCE and went strong all the way to the 15th century CE.
So who were the main players in this maritime trade?
Well, at first it was mainly Austronesian sailors from Southeast Asia. They had really advanced shipbuilding techniques.
Okay.
Later on, Persian and Arab traders sailing their dhows became prominent in the Arabian Sea and further afield. And you also had Tamil merchants from South India. Then from the 10th to the 15th centuries, China started building up its own big trade fleets and got really involved in these sea routes.
So were the sea routes totally separate from the land routes?
They were distinct, but they were definitely connected. Often they would meet up at important ports. And those sea routes built on older networks too, like the Austronesian jade and spice trade routes and the existing West Asian sea connections in the Arabian Sea. In the east, places like the Straits of Malacca and the Mekong Delta controlled a lot of the trade flow leading to southern China. The main western route went across the Indian Ocean, with key stops in Sri Lanka and southern India, and then branching into the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. There were also other routes along the Bay of Bengal and down the East African coast.
So it wasn't just one straight line, even at sea.
Right, exactly. And the term Maritime Silk Road, that's pretty recent. Like the land routes, they didn't have a specific name back then. And even though it's called the Silk Road, it wasn't just silk being traded, it was all kinds of goods, not just from Asia either.
So what were some of the advantages of sea travel over land travel?
Well, on land, goods would often change hands many times. But by sea, traders could travel the whole distance themselves. Ships could also carry much more, so it was more efficient, more bang for your buck. The types of goods were different. Bigger, bulkier stuff could be transported by sea. And the risks were different, too. At sea, you had storms and pirates to worry about. On land, it was more about political instability and bandits.
So all these routes, land and sea, they were all part of this huge interconnected system. But were there trade connections happening even before the Han Dynasty got involved and formally established the Silk Road?
Oh, absolutely. Central Eurasia had these nomadic cultures always on horseback, and they had their own trade route across the steppe route long before what we think of as the Silk Road.
Yeah.
And archaeologists have found that these nomadic groups weren't just horse breeders, they were skilled craftspeople too. As early as the 2nd millennium BCE, they were trading nephrite jade from places like Yarkand and Khotan to China. And those jade sources were pretty close to mines for lapis lazuli and spinel in Badakhshan. That suggests some pretty early connections across the Pamir Mountains.
Wow, so there was already some movement of goods across those vast distances.
Yeah, for sure. And there's even evidence of contact further back. You've got the Tarim mummies. They were found in the Tarim Basin and were from as early as 1600 BCE. And their genetics suggest some very old connections between East and West.
Really?
Yeah, some of them might have even spoken Indo-European languages. And there's also some evidence of what could be Chinese silk in ancient Egypt dating back to around 1070 BCE, though there's still debate about where exactly that silk came from.
That's amazing. So how did all these early connections turn into the Silk Road as we know it?
Well, in the 8th century BCE, China started interacting with those nomadic groups on their western borders.
Yeah.
And that's when gold was introduced from Central Asia. Chinese jade carvers started using Scythian-style animal designs in their work, too. And then there's this amazing find an elite burial in Germany from the 6th century BCE. It had Greek bronzes, but also Chinese silks. Shows how far those early trade networks reached.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it is. And the Scythians, they were all over Eurasia. They were really important in linking different regions and promoting long-distance trade. And then you had the Sogdians. They became key middlemen between China and Central Asia. Their language became like a common language for trade all across Asia.
So the foundations were there, ready for a more organized network.
Exactly. And that's where the Han Dynasty comes in. Their expansion into Central Asia around 130 BCE is what really kicked off the Silk Road as we know it. And it was largely thanks to this guy, Zheng Xian. He was an imperial envoy sent to find allies against the Xiongnu.
Right, those nomadic tribes.
Yeah, exactly. But his travels ended up being much more than that. He went all over, brought back detailed reports on kingdoms like Dayan and Fergana, the Yuezhi territories, Bactria, Kangju. He even talked about Parthia and India. And these reports showed the potential for trade and expansion westward. He basically mapped out the early routes.
So it wasn't just about military strategy, it was about economics too.
Yeah, definitely. But the Han Dynasty also wanted those heavenly horses from Fergana. They were really powerful horses, vital for fighting the Xiongnu.
Ah, so strategic reasons as well.
Exactly. And after the Han-Dayun War, China had more influence in the region. Then they started sending embassies westward, forging diplomatic and trade links as far as Seleucid Syria.
So they were reaching out pretty far.
Yeah, they were. And there's even some evidence they might have bumped into the Romans.
No way.
Yeah, some historians think a Han expedition might have encountered and even defeated some Roman legionaries at the Battle of Sogdiana in 36 BCE. Maybe remnants of Antony's army.
Wow, that's wild.
Yeah, it is. There's even speculation that the Chinese crossbow might have made it to the Roman world through encounters like this. And then you had figures like General Ban Chao, who really worked to secure those trade routes in the first century CE. He even sent an envoy, Gan Ying, towards Rome, though it's unlikely he made it all the way.
Still pretty impressive.
Oh, yeah. And by the first century CE, a maritime Silk Road was starting to develop too, connecting Chinese-controlled areas with Roman ports through India and Sri Lanka. They've even found Roman glassware in China from that period, and the first official Roman embassies arrived in China in 166 CE.
So even if they didn't meet face-to-face that much, there were definitely connections being made.
For sure. And then once the Romans conquered Egypt in 30 BCE, things really started to boom. Trade across the Mediterranean and into the East just exploded. They inherited all these existing trade networks and got a huge influx of luxury goods. It was a prosperous time for the Romans. They've even found Roman artifacts as far east as Korea.
Wow, that's a long way.
Yeah, it is. And the Greco-Roman trade with India, that just kept growing. Tons of ships were sailing from Roman Egypt to India every year. And the Romans connected to the Central Asian Silk Road through their trading posts in India.
So they were plugged into the whole system.
Oh, yeah. And they loved Chinese silk, though at first they thought it grew on trees.
Really?
Yeah, they didn't know how it was made. But Pliny the Elder, he had a better idea. In return, the Romans traded spices, glassware, perfume, stuff like that. But the Senate actually tried to restrict the use of silk because they were worried about all the Roman gold flowing out, and they thought it was too extravagant, morally speaking.
Wow, so even back then they were worried about trade deficits.
I guess so. And then, of course, the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century. That changed things quite a bit.
So what about the Kushan Empire? They were around at the same time, right?
Yeah, the Kushan Empire was around from the 1st to the 3rd century CE. They controlled a big chunk of Central Asia and North India, and they were really important in all that cultural mixing going on along the Silk Road. They found artifacts from the Greco-Roman world, China, India, all in Kushan territory. And it wasn't all about fancy luxury goods either. There was a slave trade too, unfortunately.
Yeah.
It was connected to larger slave trading networks in the area.
It's a reminder that not everything about the Silk Road was positive.
Definitely. And then after the Romans, you had the Byzantines. They were based in Constantinople, and they figured out how to make silk themselves. That gave them a monopoly in Europe.
So no more reliance on China for silk.
Not entirely. Chinese silk was still considered higher quality. But in the 6th century, the Byzantines made an alliance with the Turkic Khaganate so they could get silk directly from the Sogdians, bypassing the Persians.
Smart move.
Yeah. And they even had direct contact with China's Tang dynasty. The Chinese called them Fulin. There are even accounts of Byzantines at Kublai Khan's court. And later on, supposedly a Byzantine merchant brought a message from the Ming dynasty to the Byzantine court in the late 14th century. Those connections really show how far-reaching these networks were.
Yeah, amazing. Now, what about the Tang dynasty in China? How did they affect the Silk Road?
Well, they were pretty powerful. In the 7th century, they won some big battles in Central Asia and basically reopened the Silk Road in 639. It was closed for a while because of the Tibetan Empire, but the Tang generally kept it open for a few decades. That led to a big resurgence in trade.
So the Tang were big on trade.
Oh, yeah. They even controlled those strategic routes through the Gilded Valley for a bit. And after they conquered more territory, they dominated the whole Xiyu region. That period is sometimes called the Tang-Tubo Road.
Tang-Tubo Road. Interesting.
Yeah. And the Tang dynasty was a golden age for the Silk Road. They brought in the Second Pax Sinica, a period of peace and stability across a huge area. That made trade a lot easier. Persian and Sogdian merchants did really well, and Chinese cities became super cosmopolitan with people from all over. The Tang also developed the maritime Silk Road big time. They were sending envoys and ships all over the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, connecting with Persia, Mesopotamia, Arabia, Egypt, the Horn of Africa, you name it. So they were really pushing outward.
Definitely. And we've talked a lot about the Sogdians. It's clear they were key players in all of this.
Yeah, yeah.
They were essential. From like the 4th to the 8th centuries, they pretty much dominated East-West trade. They were the main caravan merchants in Central Asia. Some historians even say that this mix of Sogdian and Turkic culture was what really made the Silk Road thrive during that time.
It was a real cultural melting pot.
Yeah, it was. And remember, this was also a time when nomadic groups were gaining power in North China. And the Silk Road helped spread all these different religions into Central Asia and China, which brings us to the Islamic era. What happened to the Silk Road when Islam started spreading?
Well, Islam spread into Central Asia during the 8th century. And the Abbasid Caliphate, they beat the Tang dynasty at the Battle of Talis in 751. That stopped the Chinese from expanding further west.
Okay.
But it also meant that control over Central Asia was changing hands. Though the Samanid Empire in Persia, for example, they kept up that Sogdian tradition of promoting trade. And then, of course, you had the Mongol Empire. They came along in the 13th and 14th centuries and really reestablished the Silk Road.
The Mongols were pretty powerful.
Oh, yeah, for sure. They brought some stability to a huge area and ended the Islamic Caliphate's dominance over global trade. They really pushed both land and sea trade. And that's when you start to see Europeans like Marco Polo heading east. Some historians even think the Mongols might have accidentally helped spread the Black Death through their trade routes.
Wow, talk about unintended consequences.
Yeah, for real. So, what happened to the Silk Road after the Mongol Empire broke up?
Well, things weren't as unified anymore. The Armenians kept trading between Europe and Asia, and the silk trade itself kept going until the Safavid Empire collapsed in the 18th century. But the land routes gradually became less important as sea trade took over during the Age of Discovery.
So it wasn't a sudden end, more of a gradual decline.
Yeah, exactly. But let's go back to the exchange of ideas. We've talked about Buddhism, but what other religions were spreading along these routes? Oh, all sorts. You had Zoroastrianism, Judaism, various types of Christianity, including Nestorian Christianity, and then there was Manichaeism, and of course, Islam. They all spread through those trade networks, and each religion had its own communities supporting it. Buddhist monasteries, for example, were often safe havens for travelers and places where the faith was spread.
Right. And was it always just a one-way street? Did those religions change at all as they met new cultures? Oh, definitely. Syncretism. That's where different beliefs mixed together. That was happening all the time. For example, when Chinese and Xiongnu cultures met, they both adapted in things like agriculture, clothing, military tactics. And Nestorian Christianity, as it moved east, it developed its own unique ways of worshiping and took on local cultural elements.
Fascinating. And Buddhism in China, that was a big deal, right?
Yeah, Buddhism came to China through the Silk Road in the 1st century CE, and it really took root there. Different types of Buddhism spread along the Silk Road, like Mahayana, Theravada, and Vajrayana, and Chinese missionaries adapted Buddhist teachings to fit with Taoism, which was already there. Buddhism was huge for a while, but then its influence declined as Islam became more prominent in Central Asia.
So religion was constantly evolving and adapting.
For sure. And Judaism also spread eastward. Jewish people started heading east from Mesopotamia after the Persians conquered Babylon in the 6th century BCE. We don't have a lot of solid evidence of early settlements, but it's likely that Jewish merchants got involved in trade as the Silk Road grew. There were groups like the Radhanites, Jewish merchants from all over Europe and the Middle East. They had these huge trade networks from China to Rome, partly because they had good relationships with the Khazar Turks. And there's even evidence that Iranian religious ideas influenced Jewish thought during this time.
It's amazing how interconnected everything was.
Yeah, it is. And religion wasn't the only thing being exchanged. The arts were influenced too, especially in Central Asia. That's where Hellenistic, Iranian, Indian, and Chinese styles all mixed together. Greco-Buddhist art is a great example of that. And silk itself was not just a commodity, it was art too, even a form of currency.
So art was moving along with everything else.
Yeah, exactly. And the way the Buddha was depicted, that changed too during the Kushan period. They started showing him as a human figure, and that's often attributed to Greek influence. Even materials used in art, like that blue lapis lazuli, they were traded along these routes.
So the Silk Road really did influence so many aspects of life.
Yeah, its legacy is huge and still being commemorated today.
Yeah.
In 2014, UNESCO made the Silk Road a World Heritage Site because of its universal value. The UN World Tourism Organization is also promoting sustainable tourism along the routes. China even has Silk Road Week every year to celebrate its importance. And in cities like Bishkek and Almaty, they have streets named after the Silk Road. It's still relevant today.
It's amazing how these ancient routes still resonate with us.
It is. So after this whole deep dive, what do you think is the most important thing to remember about the Silk Road?
I think it's that it wasn't just about silk. It was this massive network that shaped economics, culture, politics, religion, everything across Eurasia for centuries. It connected people and ideas in a way that had never been seen before.
It was a real game changer, for sure. It spurred trade, innovation, the spread of beliefs. It left a permanent mark on so many different civilizations.
Yeah, it really was a driving force in history.
Yeah.
So here's something to think about. How is the Silk Road similar to globalization today? And what can we learn from it, especially about how cultures interact and influence each other? It's something to keep in mind long after we're done here. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for listening.
See you next time.
Okay, so you know how sometimes you bump into a piece of information and you're like, wait a minute, what?
Yeah.
That can't be right, can it?
Uh-huh.
That's what happened with this one. I gotta say,
Really?
when we saw that you flagged this Wikipedia page about Pius III in like Japanese education, I was like,
Oh, wow.
hold on, I gotta know more about this.
Yeah.
Pius III, that's like saying up is down.
It's fundamental.
Right. It's like one of those things you just know.
Yeah. Yeah. You kind of take it for granted.
Yeah.
Don't question it.
So we're here to do a deep dive into this whole thing for you
Let's get to the bottom of this.
and figure out what exactly happened with these curriculum changes in Japan around 2002.
Yeah, like, was pi actually being taught as 3?
Right. And if so, like, what were the consequences? What happened?
What were the ripple effects of that?
So the Wikipedia page talks about this whole Pius III thing, but the really interesting thing right off the bat is that
What wasn't actually the case.
it wasn't actually the case.
So the Japanese curriculum never officially taught pi as 3.
Okay.
The official value still remained 3.14.
Okay, so 3.14 always stayed 3.14.
Correct. But the revised curriculum guidelines, which came out in 1998, and these were put into practice in 2002,
Okay.
they included this tiny little, seemingly insignificant addition,
Okay.
which ended up being really significant. And it was the statement, 3 is used for the purpose.
The 3 is used for the purpose. I mean, on the surface, that doesn't sound like a huge deal.
No, not really, right?
But obviously something got misinterpreted or lost in translation.
Yeah. Well,
Because this whole Pius III thing kind of blew up.
yeah, it did.
So what were these purposes they were talking about? Why even mention using 3 at all if 3.14 was still the true value?
Right. So the guidelines were very specific about this, and they said using 3 was for estimation,
Okay.
for quick, in your head calculations,
Uh-huh.
and for getting rough ballpark figures for circular objects. So the point was to help students build number sense.
Yeah.
Get a practical feel for when an approximation is good enough.
Okay.
So, I mean, if you just need a quick idea of the circumference of something,
Right.
or the area 3 is definitely easier to work with mentally.
Right. Much easier to do in your head.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that makes sense. I can see the logic there.
Yeah.
But the Wikipedia page also mentions this thing called a restrictive provision that was kind of connected to these guidelines.
Right.
So how did that play into this Pius III thing?
So essentially this provision, it was basically telling teachers you can't go beyond
Okay.
what's in the guidelines.
Uh-huh.
You can't deviate from what it says.
So that sounds like it created a really inflexible environment.
Yeah, it kind of created this feeling that everything had to be followed very strictly.
Uh-huh.
And so when the guideline mentioned using 3 for the purpose,
Right.
some educators, and of course the public as well, they took this as like a strict instruction, potentially overshadowing the fact that 3.14 was still the accurate value.
Interesting. So the nuance kind of got lost.
Yeah, it got lost in this very rigid interpretation.
Because of that restrictive provision.
Exactly.
That's fascinating. Okay, so it's not that the content itself was wrong.
Right.
But it's how it was like interpreted and then maybe implemented.
Exactly.
That kind of led to the issue.
Yeah.
So there's this guideline with this kind of ambiguous statement.
Yeah.
And then the article talks about this event that really seemed to like set this whole misunderstanding on fire.
Right.
Which was a big advertising campaign by a cram school.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little about that?
Yeah. So in the fall of 1999, there was this major cram school company in the Tokyo area.
Okay.
And they launched this campaign that was really attention-grabbing.
Uh-huh.
And their advertisements were, they're deliberately provocative.
Okay.
They had slogans like, the formula for finding the area of a circle, radius x, radius by 3. And another one, calculate the quadrature of a circle with pi as approximately 3 instead of 3.14.
Wow. They went for it.
They really did.
I mean, it's kind of incredible how a marketing campaign can really shape the public perception of something.
Yeah, they really tapped into that existing fear about the direction of Japanese education.
Right.
And turned what was really just a minor point in the guidelines
Right.
into this symbol of, declining academic standards.
Right. So quadrature of a circle, for anyone listening who's like, what is that?
Right.
That basically just means finding a square that has the same area as the circle. Right?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, and of course the media got hold of this,
Oh, yeah.
amplified the whole
Yeah.
issue.
They love a good story like that.
Right. It's sensational.
And it's like, man, education's going downhill.
The relaxed education system, is dumbing things down.
Pius III.
Right. It became this huge symbol of, falling academic standards.
And this was in like weekly magazines, monthly magazines,
Yeah.
even journals related to mathematics.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
And usually was presented with a very critical angle.
Right.
Like, look what's happening to our education system.
So you had the guidelines, this media coverage.
Right.
And it's interesting because the article also mentions that there were some other changes happening in arithmetic learning around the same time.
Yeah, there were.
What else was going on?
So around that time, they reduced the amount of content
Okay.
in the elementary school curriculum that was related to
Okay.
multiplication, division, and decimals.
Okay, so they kind of reduced that.
Yeah, they reduced it a little bit.
Okay.
And also they moved the introduction of calculators in schools
Okay.
earlier from 5th grade down to 4th grade.
Okay, so I guess the thinking there was maybe kids are already using calculators anyway, so why not just...
Yeah, let's get them familiar with it
Yeah.
earlier on.
But I mean, I can see how when you put all those things together, that feeds into this narrative of, oh, the education system is becoming more laxed,
Yeah, exactly.
less rigorous.
Right. Less focus on those fundamental calculation skills.
Yeah, calculators early on.
Exactly.
Seems like, you're not learning the basics as much.
And so it was easy for parents and the public to kind of interpret this negatively.
But how did those specific changes, like the calculator thing, the less focus on decimals and all that,
Right.
how did that really tie into the Pius III thing?
So that's a good question. And the Wikipedia page is clear that even with this reduced emphasis on decimal calculations,
Okay.
students were still being taught decimals. They were still learning it to the nearest 110th,
Okay.
which means that the value of pi they would have used in calculations would have been 3.1,
Not 3.
not 3.
Okay.
And then on top of that, they had the calculators from 4th grade.
So they could use 3.14 if they wanted to.
Right, exactly.
So it seems like...
It wasn't so much about a direct mathematical connection, but more about how Pius III became this kind of focal point.
a symbol.
Yeah, symbol for these wider anxieties.
Right? So it wasn't really about pi. It was about the bigger picture.
Exactly.
It's so interesting how this one little thing became kind of the representative.
Yeah, the poster child.
Yeah, of the whole thing.
Of all the anxieties.
So the article mentions Akito Arima, who was the Minister of Education at the time.
Yeah.
What did he think about all this?
He expressed a lot of regret, actually.
Really?
He said he was stunned by how big the misunderstanding became. And that he regretted not doing more to explain the guidelines to the public.
Interesting.
Going out there and really making it clear what they meant.
Yeah.
So it's a good lesson in how important clear communication is,
Absolutely.
especially when it comes to education policies.
Yeah, you got to be very clear because otherwise people will fill in the gaps with their own assumptions.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what happened here.
Okay, so let's move on to the impacts
Okay.
of this misunderstanding. So how did this whole Pius III thing that was going around
Right, yeah.
affect professionals in science and education?
I mean, there were definitely discussions and concerns raised within the mathematics and academic communities.
Yeah.
They were writing about it in their journals.
Mm-hmm.
And the article mentions this anecdote about Masahiro Kamanaga, who was an associate professor.
Okay.
And he actually, at first, believed the misconception.
Oh, wow.
So
Even the
even an expert was like, oh, yeah, pi is 3.
We're getting it wrong.
That's how widespread it was.
Wow.
And the main concern among the professionals was about the loss of accuracy.
Yeah.
If you're using 3 instead of 3.14.
Right. It seems like a small difference, but...
Right, but it can make a difference.
Yeah.
So, for instance, if you use pi as 3,
Mm-hmm.
then a circle, and it's inscribed regular hexagon, would mathematically end up having the same perimeter,
Which is impossible.
which is geometrically impossible.
Right. So
Yeah.
there are real-world consequences to that inaccuracy.
Right. And also, if you have a circle with a diameter of 10 centimeters,
Okay.
the circumference calculation would be off by 1.4 centimeters.
Yeah, that's not insignificant.
No, it's noticeable.
Yeah, you'd notice that.
Yeah, so the experts were worried about the fundamental accuracy
Right.
and the potential for, mistakes in real-world situations.
Right. If you're building something, you're designing something, that 1.4 centimeters could be a big deal.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so what about the general public?
Right.
What were the impacts on society as a whole?
I think the biggest consequence for the public was this increase in distrust of the public school system.
Uh,
Pius III kind of became a rallying cry.
okay.
You know, the example of how these relaxed education policies were failing.
Right, and they could point to it.
Right, exactly.
Like, oh, look, they're teaching our kids the wrong value of pi.
It got so bad that it even seeped into popular culture.
Oh, wow.
Like there's this novel by Nisio Eisen
Okay.
that talks about the tragedy of .14.
Oh, my God.
And then you have this comedian skit with the line, pi is okay at 3.
They're making jokes about it.
Right.
Yeah.
And then there's even a lyric in the theme song for the Yutori-chan animation
Okay.
that says 3.1415 pi is approximately 3.
Wow. It really
Up and
became
everywhere.
a thing.
Yeah.
It's amazing how this one little detail about pi became this huge cultural reference point.
Right. It really captured people's imaginations.
Yeah, and even as late as 2013, this journalist, Akira Ikegami,
Yeah.
he was explaining the actual situation on a TV program.
Right.
So it shows you how long this misunderstanding kind of lingered in the public memory.
Yeah, it really stuck around.
So it sounds like universities also had their own way of addressing this.
Yeah.
Especially when it came to entrance exams.
Yeah, so the article highlights this very famous question from the 2003 University of Tokyo science exam,
Okay.
which was, prove that pi is greater than 3.05.
Okay.
And this is widely seen as a kind of subtle message.
Like, hey, come on.
Yeah, you know, pushing back against this pi is 3 idea.
Like the University of Tokyo is saying, no, this is not okay.
Pi is definitely not 3.
Right. Right.
Okay, so what was the solution?
So the intended solution, which the article mentions briefly,
Okay,
involves using a regular dodecagon.
what's a dodecagon?
It's a 12-sided polygon.
Okay, 12 sides.
Yeah, 12 sides.
Okay.
And you inscribe this dodecagon inside a circle with a diameter of 1 unit.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then you calculate the perimeter of this dodecagon.
Okay.
And you can show that it's greater than 3.05.
Okay.
And since pi is defined as the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter,
Right.
and the circumference is always going to be bigger than the perimeter of any polygon you put inside it.
Right, because it's kind of hugging the circle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Proving that the dodecagon's perimeter is bigger than 3.05
Yeah.
indirectly proves that pi is bigger than 3.05.
Okay, so it's like you're using this 12-sided shape
Right.
to get a close approximation.
Yeah, very close approximation of the circle's perimeter.
Yeah. And even with just 12 sides, you're already over 3.05
Yeah.
times the diameter.
Yeah.
So that elegantly demonstrates that pi has got to be bigger than 3.05.
That's really clever.
Yeah, it's a neat way to address it.
Yeah, it's like a subtle message, but a very clear message at the same time.
Right, like we take this seriously.
Exact.
Pi is not 3-part.
Okay, so what happened in terms of policy
Right.
to kind of fix this misunderstanding?
So around 2003, there was a shift in education policy
Okay.
back towards really emphasizing scholastic ability.
Okay.
So they did a partial revision of the curriculum guideline in December 2003,
Okay.
and they took out the restrictive provision.
Okay, so that rigidity was gone.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then in 2008, they did a bigger revision,
Okay.
which came into effect for elementary schools in 2011.
Uh-huh.
And this one got rid of the restrictive provision completely.
Good.
And it also got rid of the statement, 3 is used for the purpose.
Okay.
And instead, it explicitly stated that pi shall be 3.14.
Okay, so they just came out and said it.
Correct.
Like, no more ambiguity. Here's the deal.
Exactly. This is pi.
This is pi.
And also, this lined up with the fact that at this point, students were already learning about decimal calculations
Yeah.
before they even encountered pi in the curriculum.
So it's like a gradual shift, but they got there in the end.
Yeah.
And I guess the initial idea of
Well,
using 3 for estimation was good.
It wasn't a bad idea.
But
the misinterpretations and then all the anxiety about education at the time,
it just kind of snowballed.
it created this perfect storm.
Yeah. So we started with this question about pi in Japanese schools.
Right.
But what we've really uncovered is how easily educational policies
Yeah.
can be misinterpreted.
Sometimes dramatically misinterpreted.
Right. And how those misunderstandings can have a big impact on society and culture.
Absolutely.
Like you said, it even affected university entrance exams.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
It shows you how these things can have these unintended consequences.
Yeah. It's a good reminder that the way we communicate information is just as important as the information itself.
And this whole story makes you think, you know, how easily could a well-intentioned guideline, not just in education, but anywhere,
Right. In any field.
yeah, in any field, be misinterpreted or taken out of context.
Right.
And what does that say about how we communicate complex ideas to people?
It's a real challenge.
It is a huge challenge.
Yeah.
So think about other things that might seem straightforward,
Yeah.
but that could be subject to these kinds of widespread misunderstandings.
Right. In science, in politics, in health.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
And what happens when those misunderstandings take hold?
It can have a real impact.
A real impact.
Yeah. So food for thought, everyone.
Food for thought.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of pie.
It's been a fascinating one.
It has.
Yeah.
See you next time.
See you later.
Bye. All right, so welcome to the deep dive, everybody. Today, we're gonna be taking a deep dive into the world of Homer J. Simpson.
Oh, yeah.
So we're using as our source material his Wikipedia page, and our mission is to basically figure out like what makes Homer tick. You know, like what makes him so iconic? Why is this character so recognizable? Why is he stuck around for so long?
I think that's a great question. Yeah, what makes him so enduring?
Yeah, and it's interesting because if we look, back at sort of the beginnings, I mean, he started in shorts on the Tracy Ullman Show way back in 1987,
Wow.
and he didn't even sound, his voice was very different. It was kind of a loose take on Walter Matthau, which is wild to think about.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine like that voice saying, "Duh."
Totally.
It's just so different. But yeah, I mean, let's sort of rewind and like how did Homer even come into being? Like, what's the origin story?
Well, it's funny because his creation was a little bit of a last-minute thing.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So Matt Groening, the creator of The Simpsons, he was waiting to pitch an idea to James L. Brooks. And the idea he was going to pitch was he was going to adapt his comic strip Life in Hell.
Okay.
But when he realized that he would have to give up the rights to his comic strip if he did that, he decided to come up with something new.
Oh, wow. On the spot.
On the spot, pretty much.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So he just like hastily drew up, these crude sketches of what would become the Simpson family.
Wow.
And Homer was born.
That's so wild. It's like, out of necessity comes like this brilliant, like, just iconic creation.
Right. Like, talk about thinking on your feet.
Yeah. And the name, too. I mean, like Homer Simpson, it's so perfectly just rolls off the tongue. But there's actually some meaning behind it, right? It's not just like a random name.
Yeah. So Homer is actually Matt Groening's father's name.
Oh.
And it goes even further back. Like, the name is a reference to the ancient Greek poet Homer.
Wow.
But Groening has said that his father and Homer Simpson, the character, don't really have that much in common.
Okay.
Except, of course, for their love of donuts.
Of course. So like a little nod to the dad there.
Right.
Yeah.
But that's not the only inspiration for the name. He also got it from a minor character named Homer Simpson in Nathaniel West's novel, The Day of the Locust.
Wow, that's so cool. So it's like a blend of like personal history and literary history.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's all coming together. And what about that middle initial, that J for Jay?
So that's a reference to Bullwinkle J. Moose and Rocket J. Squirrel.
Oh, okay.
It's a nod to their creator, Jay Ward.
Gotcha.
And, The Simpsons, they often like to give little shout-outs to other people in animation.
It's like a little inside joke for the animation community.
Yeah.
That's really cool. And then, of course, first appearance on the Tracy Ullman Show, like April 19th, 1987.
Yep.
And then a couple years later, boom.
The Simpsons.
The Simpsons explodes. It's just crazy how quickly that happened.
And it's still going?
Still going. Unbelievable. Yeah. All right, so let's talk about his design. Like, what makes Homer visually Homer? Like, what are the key things there?
Well, one of the things that Matt Groening really wanted was for the characters to be recognizable in silhouette.
Okay.
And I think he definitely succeeded with Homer.
Oh, absolutely. You see that outline, it's Homer.
Right.
Yeah.
And the initial drawings of Homer, they were actually pretty crude.
Really?
Yeah.
I remember reading that they were like really simple. So is that intentional?
Yeah. Groening, he submitted these really rough sketches. because he thought that the animators would, refine them and clean them up.
Okay.
But they pretty much stuck with his original style.
Oh, wow. So those imperfections were like baked in from the beginning.
Yeah, pretty much.
That's really interesting. And there's also, I've heard this thing about him maybe resembling a Swedish cartoon character named Adamson.
Yeah, I've heard that too.
Is there any truth to that, you think, or is that just like a fan theory?
I'm not sure if it's a direct inspiration, but they do look pretty similar.
Yeah, I mean, you see it. There's definitely some shared like roundness.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. And then there's this thing about graining, like hiding his initials in Homer's design.
Oh, yeah.
That's pretty cool.
So in the original design, Homer's hairline was supposed to be an M,
Okay.
and his right ear was shaped like a G.
Wow.
The ear doesn't really look like a G anymore, but Grain still draws it that way in sketches.
Ah, so it's like a little secret like Easter egg.
Yeah, exactly.
That's amazing. I love that. And I also love, I was reading this quote from one of the directors, Mark Kirkland, who described Homer's head as like a tube-shaped coffee can with a salad bowl on top.
That's pretty accurate.
It's so accurate.
Yeah.
It's like it's just perfect. And even the way his mouth moves, like that wasn't always like set in stone.
Yeah.
Like they experimented with different things.
Yeah, so early on, the animators tried extending his mouth beyond his beard line,
Okay.
but they decided it looked too exaggerated.
Yeah.
So they abandoned that.
It's just like these tiny little details that like really like they just add up to create this iconic character.
Right.
Yeah. And speaking of details, like his hair, it's gone from like in the Tracy Ullman days, it was kind of rounded and more disheveled. And now it's like very consistently like pointed.
Right.
And I always thought it was kind of weird in some of the early episodes, like when they would show his eyebrows, they would like occasionally like draw in his eyebrows for close-ups.
I think they did that for a few seasons and then they stopped.
Yeah.
Groening didn't like it.
It's kind of jarring. It's like too much detail.
Yeah, it was too expressive.
Yeah. And of course we can't forget that brief moment where Homer went 3D.
Oh yeah, Homer 3.
Homer 3.
And Treehouse of Horror 6.
Treehouse of Horror 6, season 7. That was so trippy.
It was.
Like seeing him rendered in 3D and like interacting with this like live action world, that was pretty groundbreaking for the time.
It was really innovative.
Yeah. And even in, like within the normal animation, like when they do those like flash forward episodes where it's like set in the future, like his design changes a little bit,
Right.
He's a little heavier, a little, fewer hairs.
Yeah, he's aged a bit.
Yeah. It's pretty cool how they do that. All right, so now let's talk about like I think one of the most iconic things about Homer, which is his voice.
Oh.
Which, you hear that voice, you know exactly who it is.
Instantly recognizable.
And that is, of course, thanks to the amazing Dan Castellaneta, who also, by the way, does like a zillion other voices on the show.
He does.
But that initial Walter Matthau thing, like that's so different. Like what made him change it?
So apparently it was just really hard to sustain.
Okay.
Those recording sessions are long, like 9-10 hours sometimes.
Wow.
And it was just like exhausting to do an impression like that for that long.
Yeah. So it was like a necessity thing. He was like, I gotta find a way to do this that I can actually, maintain.
Exactly.
Yeah, it makes sense.
So yeah, by season 2, season 3, he had kind of dropped the voice down.
Okay.
And he found that deeper, more resonant tone.
Yeah.
He said he did it by lowering his chin and letting his IQ go.
I love that description. It's so perfect. It's like, it's so Homer.
Right.
And there's that great story about the SMART line. Oh, yeah.
Which was like a genuine mistake. Like he messed up the line, but they kept it.
Yeah, they kept it in.
That's just perfect.
It's so Homer.
It's so Homer.
Yeah.
And Castellaneta, he prefers to like stay in character during recording.
He does, yeah.
Which I think is really cool. Like he's really committed to being Homer.
Absolutely.
And then there's the singing, I mean, like obviously B Sharp's episode.
Oh yeah, Homer's Barbershop Quartet.
Homer's Barbershop Quartet. That's such a classic episode.
Yeah.
But they actually brought in the Dapper Dans for some of the singing, right?
Yeah, they did.
So it wasn't just Castellaneta singing.
So Castellaneta did a lot of the singing, but when they needed those really tight harmonies, they brought in the Dapper Dans.
Okay.
And sometimes Castaneda would actually sing back up to the Dapper Dans.
Wow.
Yeah, so it was like a real collaboration. That's really cool. And I mean, speaking of Castellaneta, like he's been, he's had his share of salary negotiations and even like a pay cut back in 2011,
Yeah.
To help keep the show going, which I think is pretty admirable.
Yeah, definitely.
And now he's one of the highest paid voice actors in the world, which is, it's pretty well deserved.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so let's talk about Homer's character development. So initially it was, Bart was kind of the main character.
Right.
But then Homer kind of took over, around season 4. So what do you think like led to that shift?
Well, I think Matt Groening realized that with Homer, he had so much more to work with.
Okay.
Like he's the adult.
Right.
So there's a wider range of jokes you can do.
Yeah.
And, the stakes are higher.
Yeah, for sure.
So it's just more comedic potential.
Yeah. Like the consequences of his actions are more significant. Yeah. And early on, Homer was like a lot angrier, right?
Yeah.
Like there was a different energy to him.
Yeah, he was more frustrated with his family.
Mm-hmm.
And he was more concerned about what other people thought of him.
Okay.
And over time, he kind of mellowed out.
Gotcha.
He became more comfortable with himself.
Yeah.
And he stopped caring so much about what other people thought.
And then there's the whole Jerkus Homer era, which fans like still debate.
Wow.
Like around season 7, he kind of became like a little more mean-spirited.
Right, yeah.
What do you think like contributed to that shift?
Well, I think, as the show went on, the writers were always looking for new ways to be funny.
Okay.
And they started pushing the boundaries a little bit more with Homer's flaws.
Yeah.
They wanted to make him more outrageous.
Yeah.
And to be fair, Dan Castellaneta, he would sometimes refuse to say lines that he thought were too cruel.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He thought that Homer was unthinking, but not intentionally mean.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, there is that like, even when he's doing bad stuff, there's often that like underlying like, he doesn't mean it,
Right.
Yeah. And then even in the Simpsons movie, they actually went back and like softened some of his actions to make him more sympathetic.
They did? Yeah.
Yeah. And then there's the whole like declining intelligence thing, which is kind of a running joke. Like, is Homer getting dumber over time?
Right.
And it seems like, the writers even debate this amongst themselves.
They do?
But the guideline is that he should always remember his own name.
Yeah.
Which is like a pretty low bar.
It is.
But, it's something. And there's those instances where he's like, admitting that he can't read, but then we've seen him reading before.
Right.
So it's like, they're not really like, they're not beholden to like strict continuity.
Yeah, they're willing to like bend the rules for a good joke.
Yeah. It's all about the comedy. All right, so let's talk about his personality. Like what makes Homer Homer?
Well, I think a big part of his comedic appeal is his stupidity.
Yeah.
But it's not just any stupidity. It's like a very specific kind of stupidity.
Right.
It's bumbling.
Right.
It's creative.
Yeah.
It's often self-destructive.
Right.
But it's also kind of endearing.
It is. Like he's dumb, but he's not like, he's not like malicious.
Right. Yeah. And he's lazy.
Oh, so lazy.
He's overweight. He loves food. He has a short attention span.
And he's got that like that rage,
It does, yeah.
That temper, like it can just like explode at any moment.
Right.
And of course, Moe's Tavern.
Oh yeah.
Duff beer.
Duff beer?
Like he's a man of simple pleasures.
He is.
And the show never explicitly says that he's an alcoholic, but I mean, come on.
Right.
It's pretty heavily implied.
It's pretty obvious.
Yeah. And then there's the strangling Bart thing.
Oh yeah.
Which, is definitely like one of the most controversial aspects of the character.
It is.
But Groening has said that it was like initially meant to be like just an impulsive thing, like,
Right.
not premeditated.
It's just a burst of anger.
Yeah, and then like he immediately regrets it or like forgets about it.
Right.
Which is part of the humor, but it's still a little iffy.
It is, yeah.
And then there was that mention in in season 35 like recently where he actually says that he doesn't strangle Bart anymore because of like changing social norms.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which is interesting, but then the producers came out and they were like, "Well, no, we're we're not getting rid of it completely. It's just going to be, less frequent.
Okay.
So it's still there, but it's they're trying to be a little bit more, I guess, sensitive to how that's perceived.
Yeah. It's a tricky situation.
It is. It is. But, despite all of that, like all the strangling and the drinking and the stupidity, like he does have like these really complex relationships with his family.
He does.
Like, with Bart, it's this constant, like, back and forth. They're always at odds.
Right.
And then with Lisa, he doesn't always like get her, he doesn't always understand like how smart she is.
Right.
But when it counts, he's always there for her.
Yeah, he is.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he's fiercely protective of her.
Yeah.
Even though he doesn't always show it.
Right. And then with Marge, it's very much like this, like, he loves her, but he's not always good at like expressing it.
Yeah.
But then you have those moments like, the second wedding in Millhouse Divided, where it's like you really see the depth of their connection.
Yeah, those little moments of tenderness are really powerful.
They are. And then there's Grandpa. The poor guy who's always getting like shipped off to the retirement home.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, it's not the most it's not the healthiest father-son relationship.
Oh.
But it's still Homer, and like the Sunday Times described him as a happy slave to his various appetites.
Yeah.
Which is just like so perfect.
Yeah, it really is.
Like he's all about that instant gratification.
Right.
Like he doesn't think ahead. He's just like in the moment, and he wants what he wants, and he wants it now.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then, there's that whole thing about his low IQ.
Oh, yeah.
Which is canonically 55.
55.
Which is like really low.
It is.
And they have all these like hilarious explanations for it. The Simpson gene and the head injuries and the crayon in the brain.
Great, yeah.
Which, by the way, the episode where they take the crayon out of his brain and he briefly becomes a genius. And then he's like, no, this is too much. Put it back in.
Right.
That's classic Homer.
Yeah.
And then they also, like, more recently revealed that he has narcolepsy.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, which kind of explains, all the naps.
Yeah, all the random sleeping.
Yeah. And then, the writers, they have all these different ways of describing him.
Right.
Like, Mike Rice called him a comedy writer's dream.
Oh, yeah.
And John Swartzwelder, he said that he's like a big talking dog.
Yeah.
Which is like so accurate.
Yeah,
it's like he's just driven by his base instincts.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about like his impact beyond the show. Like, I mean, he is a cultural icon.
Oh, absolutely.
Like he is one of the most recognizable characters in the history of television.
Yeah, he's definitely up there.
Yeah, and it's interesting because he's been praised by like critics and academics.
He has, yeah.
Like USA Today named him one of the top 25 most influential people of the past 25 years.
Wow.
Which is crazy to think about.
That is pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he was included in that for like representing the irony and irreverence of American humor.
Okay.
Yeah. And Robert Thompson, who's who's like a pop culture expert, he said that Homer will be studied by academics centuries from now as like a great creation in storytelling.
Wow.
So I mean, this is like serious stuff.
Yeah, he's a big deal.
Yeah, and animation historian Jerry Beck, he said that Homer is so popular because you know someone like him or you identify with him.
Right.
Like everybody knows a Homer.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the Sunday Times called him the greatest comic creation of modern time.
High praise.
That's pretty high praise.
Yeah.
And he's topped all these like greatest character lists, like Entertainment Weekly, TV Guide, Bravo, Channel 4. It just like goes on. And even in those like British polls where they asked people like, who's the greatest American?
Oh, yeah.
Homer won.
He did.
And they asked like, what fictional character would you want to be president?
And Homer won.
Homer won.
Amazing.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
And then his relationship with Marge is also like consistently ranked as like one of the best TV couples of all time.
Right.
Which, it's kind of amazing considering how dysfunctional they are.
It is, yeah.
But, they make it work.
They do.
And even like Paste Magazine ranked him as the second greatest cartoon character in 2022.
Wow.
So, I mean, he's still up there. He's still relevant.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And it's funny because like, he's often seen as like this very American character.
Right.
But Matt Groening's dad was actually Canadian.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And because of that, Homer was actually made an honorary citizen of Winnipeg, Manitoba.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. And it was based on like a misunderstanding. Like Groening had said in an interview that his dad was from Winnipeg, but he wasn't actually. But, they just went with it.
That's hilarious.
Yeah. And then, of course, there was that whole thing with the Sir Abbas giant in England where they like painted Homer next to it to promote the Simpsons movie.
Oh, yeah.
Which was a little controversial.
There was, yeah.
But, it's Homer. You gotta expect a little controversy.
Of course.
And then, of course, he's got a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame.
Oh, yeah.
Along with the rest of the family.
Yeah.
And Dan Castellaneta has won multiple Emmy Awards for his voice work.
Rightly so.
Yeah. And he's also got an Annie Award and a Young Artist Award.
Wow.
Yeah. And Homer was even honored by the National Baseball Hall of Fame for the Homer at the Bat episode, which is like such a classic episode. Yeah. And then he was also made an honorary member of the Junior Common Room at Worcester College, Oxford, which is like the most British thing I've ever heard.
It is pretty British.
And then there's even a gene in mice that's been nicknamed the Homer Simpson gene.
What?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. It's called RGS14, and when it's impaired, it actually leads to improved cognition in mice.
So the Homer Simpson gene makes mice smarter.
Makes mice smarter. I love it. All right, so let's talk about why is he so interesting to analyze? Like, why is he such a compelling character?
Well, I think as we've been talking about, he's kind of the ultimate everyman.
Yeah.
He's flawed, but he's relatable.
Right.
He's ruled by his impulses.
Yeah.
He's kind of like Dan Castellaneta called him a dog trapped in a man's body.
Yeah, that's a good one.
And Chris Turner, in his book Planet Simpson, he says that Homer is the most American of the Simpsons.
Okay.
And he argues that, while the other family members could maybe fit into other cultures, Homer is just like quintessentially American. And the writers of God in the Details, American Religion and Popular Culture, they point out that, even though he's not a good person per se, he often does the right thing.
Okay.
Even if it's by accident.
So like a happy accident kind of thing?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
And Raja Hawani, he, in The Simpsons and Philosophy, he says that Homer's love of life is actually one of his most admirable traits.
Okay.
And I think that's true. Like, he's not always happy, but he enjoys the simple things.
Yeah.
And he's always looking for a good time.
Yeah. And then there's the Homer's Enemy episode.
Oh, yeah.
Which is...
Yeah.